Alrighty, so today's session is actually two different presentations. The first presentation is very short. It's giving users choices with actions. And if you were in the session a few weeks ago, you have a head start on the first part of the session today, because we did talk about what's new in interactive dialogues. And part of that, of course, was the menus, menu statement. And we have the on action clause in menu statements. So we've actually discussed a lot of what we'll talk about in this short presentation today in the session a few weeks ago. So if you missed that, you might want to go out and view the recording. And today's session will also be recorded, and we post those on the 4js.com site under the Training tab, and we have a View Recording link set up there where you normally would register for the session. So since you registered for the session, you can just find that View Recording link in the same place that you used to actually register when you were ready to register for the session. Sorry about that. I'm cleaning my glasses this morning. All right, so the first part of the session is giving users choices with actions, probably about 15-20 minutes worth of material at the most. And then we'll go ahead and look at a short demo on actions. And then we'll get back into the session and look at menus, top menus, toolbars, and start menus. And we do have about 50 slides in the presentation today, which is a lot. But the good news is that a lot of the menus are implemented in a very similar way. So once we know how to, let's say, implement a top menu, we just go through the same basic process for toolbars as well. So that saves us some time. Here's our agenda. Usually when we start a session, I'll mention that a lot of times we don't really need the entire 2 hours. Sometimes we get finished in an hour, sometimes it takes a bit longer. Today will probably take about an hour and a half. I'm just estimating. And if we need to, we'll take a 10 or 15-minute break. But I believe we've only had to do that one time during all of our Training Tuesday sessions. So if we don't absolutely need it, we'll just keep going and probably finish in that hour and a half time frame. If you need to leave the training session, that's just fine. You can leave and rejoin. It won't bother anybody in the session. It won't bother me. And a reminder that we will be recording it, so if you have to leave, you can always come back and watch the recording at your own disposal. So it'll be out there along with all the other sessions that we've recorded for the last month or so. If you have any questions for me, if you think of it while the session's taking place, you can use the chat interface. Otherwise, if you think of it later, you can use my email, lchildress@4js.com. Sometimes it does take me a day or so to get back with you, but I will respond. So you might just have to be patient for a day or so. This is your interface for the Go to Training sessions. Should be pretty similar to what you see right now. Right here's the viewing area where you'll see my slide presentation. You have a control panel that you can use to control some things, not everything that we see here, but you can close your control panel with the red arrow icon up at the top. You won't actually have to mute yourself with the mute button because I've muted everyone prior to the session starting today. I mentioned earlier that you could use this chat interface down at the bottom if you need to send me a question or if you want to communicate with some of your fellow session attenders. You can use that chat interface. And the raise hand icon that I was asking you to raise a minute ago when we did the audio check is right there at the bottom. Here's just a bigger picture so you can see it better. I don't remember if I mentioned the audio section. So since that's highlighted, we'll take a look at it, or since it's got a big square around it, we'll take a look at it. I noticed a lot of you are here the same way I am with mic and speakers, but you also have a telephone option. So if you do have problems with your system speakers, you can get on using the telephone. If you click that option, you should be able to see a telephone number that you can use to call in. Okay, so that takes care of all of the preliminaries. Let's go ahead and take a look at actions. Again, it won't take very long to get through the actions part of the presentation. I'm just looking here. It looks like there's 14 or 15 slides to it. And again, if you saw the session a few weeks ago on the interactive dialogues, you have a bit of a head start on this part of the session. So the first page, or the first slide, is terminology about actions that you may already be familiar with. Actions are events triggered by interactive elements in the program. So interactive elements might be a button, for example. So actions can be triggered by interactive elements like buttons, toolbar, items, top menu options, all the things we're going to look at in the session today. We manage actions with action views and action handlers. Whoops, let me grab a marker here so I can show you where I'm at. So again, with the terminology here, an action view is just a graphical object that we associate with actions. So an action view, again, might be a button, a toolbar item, and so on. And the action views are what the user would use to be able to select or trigger an action. And then finally, down at the bottom, action handlers are defined with an on-action clause or command clause. We'll see later that that's still supported as well. And that's what you're doing as a result of a user triggering an action by selecting a button or toolbar item. So that's in the actual code. What do I want to do if a user selects the print button, for example? We handle all of that with this action handler. So in our on-action clauses in our code, these action handlers execute a set of instructions, and they can be used with any of the interactive dialogue instructions. So that would include menu, input, input array, and so on. Possibly the most important part of the actions part of the presentation is this page on action binding. So action views, like our buttons or toolbar items, are bound to an action in the code. That's how our action handler knows what instructions to implement based on the name attribute. So a lot of times it's easy to get that confused with the text attribute, which is what the user sees on the screen. But it's actually the name attribute is the important one for action binding. So as an example, I've got a toolbar button might have the name attribute set to quit, and that is bound to an action having the name quit. So in our on-action clause, we would have an on-action quit, and it will automatically bind that action to our toolbar button, our action view that has the name quit. So that's the part that's important. It's not the text attribute, it's the name attribute. So when the user selects an option, like a button, for example, in the menu panel, the action view triggers the action event and executes the code for our corresponding action handler, for example, in our on-action clause in the code. Something that's convenient for us is that action names aren't case sensitive. So, for example, if I have on-action print in my on-action clause, capital P-R-I-N-T would be the equivalent of lowercase p-r-i-n-t. So it doesn't actually matter how we type those names in. The compiler takes care of storing it in lowercase so that we don't have to worry about being case sensitive with the actual name attributes. So that's handy. Here's the syntax. Let me grab my marker here. Highlighter seems to be the easiest for being easy for you to see. So here's the syntax. So we've got on action print. So print here is the name of our action. And then here we have a .per file and a button defined in the attributes section of the .per file. And notice that the button name is print. Right? So the name attribute of that button has to match the name of the action in our on action clause. So that's the important part. The text is just what the user sees. So the text really doesn't have anything to do with the actual binding of that action view to the actual action in the code. There's actually some predefined action in the Genero BDL language. And again, it's more for convenience than anything else. So there's certain action names for common operations for these interactive instructions like menu, display, construct, and so on. And they refer to those as predefined actions because the names are already known. For example, there's an accept predefined actions that we've got listed here on the screen. I'm going to grab a marker real quick. Right, so there's an action accept. There's a predefined action called cancel. And they already have some default handler, predefined handlers for accept and cancel. They have some default attributes configured. For example, OK is the text that will by default appear for the action accept. You don't have to go in and predefine that attribute. It'll do it for you. Same thing for cancel. It has predefined attribute text here. So the user will see the word cancel associated with that cancel action. So those are predefined actions. They have predefined handlers already configured, and they even have predefined attributes like OK, cancel for the text. Another one here is display and input array. They have two predefined actions. There's a nextrow and prevrow attribute that you can use for images, for example. They automatically have default images already configured because they're predefined. There's already a handler so that it knows to go forward when you select next row. It needs to go backwards if you use previous row. So those are some default characteristics for display and input array. And down at the bottom, help. There's a help predefined action that automatically starts the help viewer if you have help clauses with your dialogues. We'll take a look at some of the predefined actions at the end of the actions part of the presentation, and I'll show you where a lot of those attributes are predefined, and you can get a better feel for how that actually works. Now, let's say that I don't like the default attributes, let's say for accept and cancel. I can actually go in if I want to and define my own action views instead of using a default action view that it will automatically put up for the user to use. So I can create buttons or toolbar icons and associate those with the action name accept or cancel. And if I do that and I set my own actions and attributes, then that will actually override. They refer to it as overriding, but I think of it as overriding, R-I-D, the actual defaults. So you can always override these defaults that you see for the predefined actions, but if you choose not to explicitly define them, you'll see them automatically be displayed in certain areas, like the construct interactive instruction, for example, uses OK and cancel automatically. Now, action defaults are where you can go in and define ahead of time attributes for your action views, like the text attribute that we saw a minute ago, comments, images, accelerator keys. Those are all things that can be predefined in what they call the action defaults. Now, you can define action defaults a couple of places. You can define them in the actual form specification file, And if you do it that way, then those action defaults are restricted to that specific form. So if you have a form that's a little bit different, for example, from, let's say, the majority of the forms that your application uses, you might prefer or need to define the action defaults at the form level, and then those are reserved, let's say, for that specific form. Another way that you can use action defaults is more at the interface level. So we'll see a little more about that here in a few minutes. There is a default action default file with the name default, default.4ad, but you can create your own actions default file. Let's say you want to override some of the default or predefined action defaults that you see there. We recommend that you create your own actions default file instead of editing or modifying the default 4AD file, and that way you have it out there as more of a template, and you can specify your own actions default file and load it instead of the runtime system using the default. So here's the syntax for entries in the action defaults file. There at the top, our syntax. You can see it's an XML file, so we have action defaults, and here's the end of the action default list. Here's the action name. Remember, the all-important action name attribute goes here, and that's what is going to bind the action defaults in this XML file with your actions in your code and your action views, is by that action name. And then you specify your list of attributes. So here's an example. Here at the bottom, we've got the action print. Here's the text we want to see by default. Let's say for a print button, as an example, we want to have an image be displayed. Here's a printer image that we're using here for an action default. So I don't have to define these action defaults now in the form or in the code. Instead, if I just leave them here in the actions default file, it's a good way to centralize all the attributes for the actions that I commonly use. They can get them here out of this file in a central location instead of all the different programmers having to code these at the actual program level or in the actual form specification file. So it's another time saver and another way to try to standardize across the entire application. Here's a list of attributes from the XML file that we just looked at, the action default file. Excuse me. Here's the name attribute that I pointed out on the previous slide. And that identifies the action. So that's the part that we said was important because it binds the action defaults that we're setting here in the XML file with the actual actions by name and the action views by name. Here's the text. So if we want to use some default text that will be displayed when our actions are visible to the users, we can specify the text attribute. Comment. For example, if you hover over a menu item, you might see the comment, the image, like the printer image we talked about on the previous page. And you can also define accelerators as well. You can actually define more than one accelerator. We're just showing one here in the slide just because there's not enough space to show all the different attributes you can specify, but you can actually define up to 4 accelerator keys for an action if you want to. Most people are content with 1, but you can have up to 4. And this context menu attribute just indicates whether an action should appear if you use a context menu, one of the right-click menus. And the default is yes. So if you don't want an action to show up at a context menu, then you can set that to no. And the default view indicates that the front end has to show the default action view. So if it doesn't have to show it, if you haven't explicitly defined it, if it's in the on action clause, for example, the front end will actually create a default action view for an action. If you don't want it to do that, then you can set this to no, and it won't appear by default if it's not explicitly defined in the on action clause. We mentioned, or we saw a minute ago, that you could specify attributes in various places. We had action defaults, for example, that we could specify in the form. There's an action defaults section in the form. You can specify special attributes for an object right there in the form in the attributes section of the form. For example, for a button that you've defined, you can define the text for the button right there by the actual object itself in the attributes. And we also just talked about being able to specify it in an actions default file, an XML file. So there is a precedence for which place your actual attribute will be taken from when it's displayed to the user. So the precedence we can see here is if you've actually defined attributes for an object in the form for a specific element in the attributes section of the form, that has the highest precedence, and it will use that, and that will override attributes that are specified anywhere else. The action default section of the form, for example, or the action defaults file, the XML file. So that has the highest priority or the highest precedence. Now, if you haven't specified attributes for a specific element right there in the attributes of the form, then the next highest priority is the action defaults section of the actual form specification file. Also, I mentioned earlier that you could load action defaults from an XML file through a method. So if you've actually loaded your action defaults from your XML file with this UI.form.loadActionDefaults object method, that has the same priority or precedence as defining the action defaults section right there physically in the form. So it's really the equivalent of doing it that way. It's just less work. I can go in and configure an action defaults file, an XML file, and then load that in the application dynamically instead of someone having to go out and edit all these .per files or form specification files. And then finally, the lowest precedence or the lowest priority is if we do have an action defaults file that we're using. We could be loading that with an interface method, or we could be just using the default actions default file, default.4ad, that's in the lib directory, and that attribute has the lowest priority. It's always there. So if I go to the trouble of, let's say, loading action defaults in my form or creating action defaults manually in the form, or specifying attributes explicitly for elements in the form, then those are going to have a higher priority than just the default action defaults. It's a little redundant. So we talked about loading action defaults, and there's actually two different methods you can use to load them. There's an interface method that's a class method that we see here at the top. The UI interface class has a load action defaults method, and you can use that method to load your action defaults at the interface level, the top level. That makes your own action default file available to all the forms that the application uses, right? So that's kind of a top level action defaults file available for all forms. However, down here at the bottom, we do have another method It's a form level method. The UI form class also has a load action defaults object method. And of course, to use the object method, you first have to get a reference to a specific form that you want to load your special action defaults into. So what you might consider doing is more or less having two levels of action defaults. You might have one that you use at the interface level for almost all the forms in your application. But let's say there's a specific form or a few specific forms that have some perhaps special actions or special attributes that you want to set that's a little different from everything else. And you can use the form level method, the object method, to load those action defaults for that specific form. Okay. So I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the session that it wouldn't take very long to get through the information we have on actions. Part of that is really a review from earlier sessions we had. But before we take a look at it, would anybody like to ask any questions or anyone have any comments about actions before we look at Studio and take a look at some of the actions and action defaults? Okay, let's pop over here to Studio. Let me minimize my control panel and get it out of my way here. There we go. All right, so we talked about the binding process for actions early on in that presentation. So let's take a look at some action binding. So I have just a program called Simple Menu here that I've pulled up. Here's the 4GL file. Here's a form specification file called simple.per that I'm using. So first let's just run the program and take a look at it. See what it does. All right. So it opens a little window here. Action binding test. It's our title. It says these two buttons are explicitly defined action views. Now by explicitly defined, we're just talking about a button, for example, has been configured in our .per file in this case, and those explicitly defined buttons have been bound to our action add by the name attribute. So when I click the button add, that triggers our action in our code, in our on action clause, for example. And the only thing we're doing there, the only thing the action handler is doing, is just giving us a message, triggered action add. Now typically you would be calling a, let's say a function, for example, to actually do something exciting when somebody clicks an add button. But for our demo, we're just displaying a message, triggered action add. Now over here on the right-hand side, I've got another button called default. And if I click that button, that also triggers an action, and all that's doing as well is just displaying a message, default action view. So these two buttons are explicitly defined. This button over here was actually created dynamically by the runtime system because I don't have a button explicitly defined for it in my form. So let's take a look. Let's quit out of here. Here's my .per file. I'm going to close this to give you a better view. So here's my button definitions, B1 and B2, and I've defined them explicitly here in the .per file. Down here at the bottom in the attributes, here's where I've got button B1. There's the name of the button, and that of course is the part that binds this action view that I'm configuring to the actual action handler in the code, in the on action clause. So I've got add here for the button name, and I have on action add in my code. So that's the part that binds the action view to the actual action in the code. The text attribute Now again, if I had my action defaults configured in an XML file like we talked about a minute ago, then I really don't need these text attributes. But I've defined them here in the form, and remember, if I define them in the form, that has the highest precedence. So even if I do have add defined in an action default file, this text equal add attribute that I've added here in the form specification file is going to have a higher priority. So I'll see this as a user instead of whatever might be defined in my action defaults XML file. And here's button 2. Quit is the name of button 2, and so that's going to be bound automatically to an action quit in the code. And again, what the user sees is the text attribute, quit, all uppercase. Now it doesn't really matter, again, if I put add here for the name attribute. I could use uppercase or lowercase, and it would still be interpreted or translated by the compiler so that it's stored in lowercase, so it's not really a problem. Now we recommend that you use lowercase for the name attribute to save, maybe save confusion, but it's all really handled by the compiler. All right, so that's what we have in our form specification file. We have a couple of explicitly defined buttons. Now notice though that we have not explicitly defined a button for default, right? We don't have a button called default here in our form specification file. But we do have, let's look over here in our 4GL program, we do have an action called default. Right? So on action default in our code. So the actual runtime system is automatically creating that button called default that we saw when we ran the program, and it uses the default presentation characteristic. It just puts it in a little menu panel on the right side of the screen. Uh-oh, I have my little pop-up that says that I have degraded audio quality. That probably means I'm leaning forward to look at the screen. Everybody okay? Able to hear me okay? Give me a hands up if the audio. Okay, thanks, Lois. Everybody, thanks, Lois. Okay, very good. So I have to quit leaning forward. So there's my on action default, and since I didn't explicitly define a button in my form specification file, it will automatically display a button in the default location over on the right-hand side of the screen in a little menu panel. Now I can certainly change that behavior. In our next session, we're going to talk about styles. So I could use a style to change the default behavior of putting that button over on the right-hand side, or I could explicitly define a button called default and put that button wherever I like. So that's just the default behavior. All right, so we'll run it one more time now that you've seen it. So here's my two buttons that we had explicitly defined in our .per file, add and quit. Of course, we're seeing the text attribute here in the form. And then over here on the right is our default button that was created automatically. So it's a default action view that was created because I didn't explicitly define an action view for that action default. All right, so that's the binding, right? So it's the name attribute that's so important to bind our action views that we've configured with the actual actions in the code. Something else we talked about was predefined actions. So let's take a look at what they mean by predefined actions. There's an application here in the BDL tutorial that you might have experimented with in your own environment. I'm using the BDL tutorial for some of our demos here. And there's one here that has a construct. So we're going to take a look at these predefined actions that get displayed or get created when we use a construct. Just trying to make sure I've got the right program here. Let me see. Okay, this is it. All right, so when we click on this Find button, that puts us in a construct in the application. And as soon as we enter that construct interactive dialog, we automatically see these predefined actions. OK and cancel are the text. So that's accept and cancel are the actual names of the predefined actions. But remember, the text attribute is also, we'll say, predefined. And so we automatically see an OK button. So when we click OK, there's actually some default handler instructions that are taking place there. And it validated our OK, validated our form, and we see that it went on in the code to the next instruction. So that's OK and cancel. Those are our predefined actions. And of course, cancel quits out of the iteration or stops the iteration. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So nowhere in the code have we defined actions OK, or an action accept, or an action cancel. Those are predefined and actually created for us by the runtime system when they're needed. Okay. Let me close these. This is the custquery.4gl file. Here's the construct. I just wanted to show you. Okay, so there's the construct by name. And as soon as we entered that construct interactive dialog, the runtime system went ahead and created our OK, or our default action views associated with the accept and cancel actions. And all of that was done automatically. So there's nothing in here where we say on action accept or on action cancel. It's all predefined. So I just wanted to show you that. There's nothing here in the menu. There's no command accept, no command cancel. So those are predefined actions. They're all automatic. And again, if you do go in and explicitly configure those actions, for example, add them to an on action clause, go in and explicitly configure a button, for example, that's associated with accept, that would be the name would equal to accept, then that will override these defaults that we see with the predefined actions. But they're handy. I didn't have to do anything at all to see that OK and cancel button. Now let's say that we want to go in and create action defaults in an XML file so that I don't have to keep going into all these individual forms and configuring attributes for form elements manually. It's easier and a better way to standardize if we do it in an action defaults file. So let's take a look at an action defaults file. Close this. I thought perhaps that I already had one out here, but I don't, so that might be a good thing. Let's go ahead and just see how you add one. So you can create your own action defaults file. I've got a little library here called external files that I'm going to add my action defaults file to. So I'm going to add it to this external files library to keep all my external files together. So I can say new file, templates, and get some help creating my action defaults file. So here's action defaults. Notice action defaults end with a 4AD extension. So when I click on that, it wants me to save it. So I'll call it, I'll be really creative here and call it my defaults. All right, so now we can see I've got a special XML file called my defaults that has my action defaults in them. Now right now all of my action defaults are exactly the same as the default action defaults file called default. That's a lot of defaults here. But I can go in here now that I have my own action defaults file and I can make some changes to it. Now before we make any changes, let's find the predefined actions. So right here is one predefined action. This is accept. Now this is the one that we saw earlier. Here's cancel. And you can see there's a lot of defaults configured, and a lot of them are really what they're for are for predefined actions. That way you already have text attributes, comment attributes, images, all of those types of things predefined for these predefined actions. So let's say that we want to change something. We can just go in and change if we want to. Trying to find an interesting one. For example, query. If I'm not happy with the word search, I can change the text in my own action defaults file to, whoops, it bounced up to modify. Well, let me change that one. That way it'll save us a little time. So if I'm not happy with the default text for modify, I can just change it here. There we go. So I can change it to change. And again, in the text attribute, of course, it is case sensitive. So uppercase C matters. The user will actually see an uppercase C there. There we go. Change it. So now the default text will be change it instead of whatever the action default was when we made our file. So this is a place where you can centralize all of your, we'll call it decoration for all of your actions. Text, images, accelerator keys, comments can all be defined here in one place, and then that will be available for all the actions, all the forms in your application. Okay, that's probably good. So we'll close out of there. One more time here. Bring up our presentation, and we'll pick up where we left off with start. Let's see, menus, top menus, toolbars, and start menus. Second part of our presentation. If you have any questions about actions or action defaults, loading action defaults, and so on, feel free to send me an email, or you can use the chat interface if you like to do that. Okay, so here we're talking about menus, and it says menu items are action views tied to the actions defined by the current interactive statement. And we talked about that in the previous presentation. So interactive statements, of course, are menu, input, input array, and so on. Menus in Genero have some differences from menus in 4GL. So if you come from a 4GL environment, Genero menu items we just saw are action views. So if you import a 4GL program into Genero and recompile it, your command and on-key clauses become buttons in a menu panel, like that default button that we saw in our action demo a few minutes ago. And again, by default, you'll see that be on the right-hand side of the interface, at least for most of the front ends that we have. So for Genero, these, whoops, forgot how sensitive it is, I clicked. Menu items are action views, And we saw a minute ago how we can use the name attribute to tie those action views to, for example, the onAction clause in the actual code. When a user selects a menu item, the program receives an action event corresponding to the program trigger the item is bound to. So it sounds very complicated, but essentially it's just what we talked about in the previous presentation. The action view and the action itself in the code are bound together by the name attribute. And when a user triggers an action by selecting, let's say, a button or an item in a top menu, that will trigger the action handling code, right? The action handler in the code. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but a menu item is automatically disabled and enabled depending on the current interactive statement. So, for example, let's say I have a print action, like onAction print, for example, in a display interactive dialog. If the user is in the display interactive dialog, then that action is automatically enabled, right? The user is allowed to select the print option, right? The action view is enabled so that he can select it and trigger the action print. If the user is not currently in that display interactive dialog where the print action is defined, then the menu item is disabled automatically, right? And by disabled it means grayed out. So that happens automatically. I don't have to do anything to make that happen. It's just part of the way the program works, right? It's automatically built in. So items are disabled and enabled depending on where the user is in the code. So if he's in part of the application that does not contain an action, then the action is disabled. And it will be enabled again if he returns back to that particular interactive instruction that contains that onAction clause. Now that's the default behavior, right? So it's disabled and enabled automatically when the user is in an interactive statement that contains the onAction clause for that action. But down here at the bottom, since menus are part of the abstract user interface, that means that you can manipulate them yourself dynamically at runtime. If you remember from the session we had on classes and methods, we have methods that you can use as part of the UI.dialog class, for example, that you can use to make actions active or make actions inactive, right, with special methods. So you can also manage that dynamically with special methods. But the default behavior is based on where the user is in the code. When he's in an interactive instruction that has an onAction clause with an action, then it's automatically enabled. When he leaves that interactive instruction, that menu item is automatically disabled. So that means the action view is grayed out. So we saw actually in the demo a few minutes ago how menu buttons are generated automatically in the right-hand side of the screen. And that's common for most of the front ends that you can use. The desktop client that we're using for demonstration purposes, that's the default behavior. So unless you've gone in and explicitly defined buttons in the form specification file or configured a style, the default behavior will be a little menu panel in the right-hand side of the interface. And here it says the menu buttons display in a specific area, like the right-hand side of the interface, depending on the front end, the client software. Now most of the front ends, like GDC, the Genero Desktop Client, and most of the web clients, GWC, also display menu buttons on the right-hand side of the interface. One big exception is Ajax. If you select the Genero web client and use the default, I just call it web, but it's Ajax, it will actually display the menu buttons at the top of the form, the top of the window. So it's different from the other front ends. But it does depend on the front end you're using. So there's our on action find. So the text that the user actually sees, the text attribute, looks like it's set to query. So when the user triggers that find action by clicking on the query button, that's going to invoke the action handler, and it's going to call a function called query cust. All right, so here's attributes for menus. I mentioned earlier that you can define styles. So we actually saw these in our previous session. Right, our default menu style is what we've been looking at in our demonstrations, but you can also use a dialog style or a pop-up style, if you like, and that tells it how to display the window. Dialog, remember, pops up a menu in its own separate window, and pop-up gives you the context type menu. I think of it as a context menu. You can also specify comments and images for menus as attributes. So here's an example at the bottom. So I've got a menu called attribute. We're using the dialog style so that menu will pop up in its own window, and then we'll also see the comment delete associated with it. Some considerations for menus. We saw the styles on the previous page, the default, dialog, and pop-up styles. It's saying you can't actually create your own styles. Genero has a lot of flexibility and a lot of functionality, but there's a few things that we're, I guess we could say, stuck with. And one of them are these styles for menus. So we have these three styles, the default, the dialog, and the pop-up, and you can't actually create a whole new style for a menu. In the session last week, we talked about the on idle clause that you can use in an interactive dialog statement. For example, menu, you can specify on idle 30, whatever number of seconds that you consider reasonable, and then you can define some instructions that you want to execute if a user is idle in that menu for the number of seconds that you define. For example, you may want to exit the menu or perhaps even exit the program. We talked earlier that you can define a window style to change the menu panel position or make it disappear altogether. You may want to do that. For example, if you're using top menus or toolbars, you may not want that menu panel to be over there on the right-hand side, and you can do that by specifying a window style. I won't talk about it any more than that because our session in 2 weeks is actually about styles, so I'll kind of reserve a little about styles for the 2 weeks, the next session. And a menu is a set of actions, and you can define different kinds of views for actions, which leads us to the next page. That's a good segue. Top menus. We were just saying that all we were looking at there, or all the user is looking at, is an action view, and there's a lot of ways that we can display action views, or a lot of ways we can implement action views. And here's another one. We've got top menus and we have toolbars. So first one we'll look at here is a top menu. So a top menu is another view for actions, but this one is displayed or presented as a typical pull-down menu. Most of us are pretty familiar with top menus. However, underneath the covers, we've got the same behavior with top menus and toolbars that we saw earlier with just our standard menus. It's still that all-important name attribute that matters. So in our top menus, the items in our top menu, the name attribute is still what ties it to the actual on-action clause, right? The action in the on-action clause. And just like we saw a second ago, menu items, our buttons, are enabled and disabled according to the current interactive statement, current interactive instruction. So again, if I have an action called print defined in an on-action clause in a particular interactive instruction like a display, then it will be enabled when the user is actually in that display interactive instruction, and it'll be grayed out or disabled when the user leaves that interactive instruction or when he's not in that interactive instruction. And that's all automatic. So top menus are simply another way of viewing actions. So the way the user interacts with them, all the rules we saw about having to use the name attribute to bind these menu options with the action in the code are still the same. We still use the name attribute to do that. Okay, that's probably good here. Oops. Okay, so defining top menus, you're going to see a lot of similarities here. Action defaults, top menus, toolbars are all very similar in their behavior. So this will sound very familiar. If I want to define a top menu, I can define it for a specific form, just like action defaults a few minutes ago. I can define it for a specific form 2 or 3 different ways, which I'll get into here in just a second. But I can also define a top menu in a 4TM file, an XML file, just like we saw with action defaults. The big difference, of course, is it has different information in the XML file, and the extension is 4TM instead of 4AD. Here's where it's talking about the extension. But the basic idea is just the same, right? The idea of being able to load a top menu dynamically and centralize the look and feel of my top menus in a file instead of a programmer going into an individual form and defining it manually. That makes you prone to making mistakes. It's hard to make things look exactly the same when you have to redo them, so to speak, over and over in these individual form files. And if you'll create a .4tm file and specify your top menu there, then you only have to do it in one place. So you're more standardized that way. And that's what they're talking about here at the bottom. Using a 4TM file allows you to reuse top menus with different forms. So you can use them for all the forms, for example, in your program if you want to. So it's more portable this way. So very similar to the behavior we saw with action defaults. So we said that a top menu, like an action default or like action defaults, can be defined in a form. So here is what it looks like, or here's the syntax for defining it in a form. So the top menu section, we're doing this in order actually, according to a .per file. This would go right below the action defaults section if you used action defaults. So here's the top menu keyword. Here we can specify a group for the top menu. Notice you can nest groups as well. It's not really considered a good usability practice to nest more than 3 levels. So you might keep that in mind if you possibly can avoid it, but you certainly can if you want to. You can nest the groups as far as you want. Notice you have a separator that you can use to separate items in the group. Puts a little horizontal bar, horizontal line between items. And here's what it actually looks like. So here's an example of a top menu in a form. And of course this is defined in the top menu section right below the schema and action defaults section of the form. Here's our group. This time you can actually see there's the text. So that ties it to the picture we see, the image we see over here on the right-hand side. Here are the commands in our top menu. So command first. So there's the action view created. The text is first. Command next. Right? So those will be enabled whenever the user is in an interactive instruction that actually names the action that's bound to the name we see here, like first, next, previous, and so on. And there's the separator. Just point that out real quick. Right? Here's the separator over here, this horizontal line that we see. Here's a second group called options, and here's the group for it. So we have two groups defined, navigation and options, and then we have our individual items defined by name. Command accept. Accept has to match an action in the code. Actually, sorry about that. I happened to pick on a particular one here that's a predefined action. But all of these at the top, first, next, previous, and so on. Here's the 4TM file. So this would be a better way of defining top menus. For most cases, would be to define it in a special XML file with a .4TM extension. And this is more reusable, we said. So I can load this top menu into any form. I can also load it dynamically if I like. So I can make it available to all forms in the program by loading it at the interface level, or I can make it specific to us, or make it available only to a specific form by loading it at a form level. Here's the top menu attributes. There's a lot of them, so I'll go pretty quickly. These are the attributes for the top menu groups. So there's the text here that the user sees. I'll just point out kind of some highlights. So there's the text we want to have displayed for the group, comments, images. Notice that you can hide an entire group, maybe based on different sets of users that you have, and maybe some of those users have permissions to see menu options in a particular group and some users don't. So you can actually hide an entire top menu group with this hidden attribute. And of course you can do that dynamically at runtime with some of these special classes and methods we've talked about. Here's attributes for the individual commands in the top menu. And again, the important one is the name attribute up here at the top. That's what actually binds it to the action in the code. Here's the text attribute that the user sees. And again, comments, images can all be defined. Accelerators can be defined. And here again is that hidden attribute. So this is telling us that we can actually hide an individual top menu command if we want to. So not only can we hide the entire top menu group with all the options in the group, but we can also hide an individual command. And when it says hidden, that's not the same thing as disabled, right? So there is a big difference between the two. Disabled is grayed out. The user can still see it if it's disabled, but if it's hidden, like we see here with these two attributes for the group and the individual command, it actually is just not there, right? So it doesn't show up at all. The user never knows that there is a specific group or command that he can't see. And finally, there's even attributes for the separator, right? The little horizontal line that you can create to separate commands. So even it has a hidden attribute if you want to hide the separator. Okay, so we're ready to load top menus, and just like action defaults, you can load a top menu at two levels. You can load it at the interface level, which makes it available for all the forms in your application, which is nice, but you can also load it at the form level. Right? There's an object method, UI.form load top menu, which is an object level method. Of course, you have to get a reference to a specific form before you can use that form method. So that loads the top menu at the form level, just for a specific form. Here they're showing you loading a top menu with an initializer function. We talked about initializer functions also in the last session, I believe. And the idea here is you can use an initializer function. Grab my highlighter here. And that initializer, that set default initializer, the initializer is automatically invoked anytime a form is opened in the application. So that's what this set default initializer method will do. It automatically invokes a function that you specify here. Anytime a form is opened, that initializer is going to invoke this function, top menu from XML. And then right here in this function that this initializer will call every time a form's opened, one of the things you can do is load your top menu. There'll probably be a lot of things that you would do when you initialize a form when it gets opened, but one of the things you might want to do is load a top menu. So this it's like a global function, right? The set default initializer is more or less giving you all the features of a global function so that any time a form gets opened in the application, it's going to automatically kick off a function and pass the information, this form, a reference to the form, to the function. Okay, so we're switching gears, and again we'll see a lot of similarities with toolbars. So toolbars are yet another way to present actions to the user. So we have menus, we have top menus, we have toolbars. So here's what a toolbar looks like. I'm sure most of you are familiar with toolbars. There's a picture of one here on the right-hand side. So it's just another view, provides buttons that can trigger events in an interactive instruction. Just a fancy way of saying it's just like menus and top menus. We've got toolbar items that are tied or bound to action views and actions by the name attribute. Right? So the toolbar item would be the action view. The action view is bound to the action handler in the code by name. So just like we saw with regular menus and top menus, these toolbar items are disabled and enabled according to where the user is in the code. So when the user is in an interactive instruction that has an on action, for example, that names one of the actions for the associated action view, then it's enabled. When he leaves that current interactive instruction, then it will automatically disable the toolbar item. So that behavior is just the same. Just another way of presenting options to the user. So all of this will be familiar as well, so I'll move fairly quickly here. You can define a toolbar in the actual specification file, just like you can for top menus and action defaults. You can also specify a toolbar in an XML file. And of course, the extension for the XML file is going to be a bit different. It's going to be a .4tb for toolbar. So instead of a 4ad for action defaults or tm for top menu, we're going to have a .4tb. All of these files you can get a helper for if you decide to create one, the same way we saw for action defaults. You can go out to the New File menu option, and there's a Templates option from there at the very bottom. And we have templates that you can use to get you started creating your own toolbar or top menu or action defaults, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so I can define a toolbar for a specific form in a per file. That's what we have up here at the top in the toolbar section. We'll see a picture of that here in a minute, what it looks like. But you can also use Form Designer for top menus and toolbars as well. I don't think I've mentioned that before, but if you're using Form Designer, you just right-click on the form level object in the structure view, and there's an option there to add a top menu or add a toolbar, as we're talking about here. So you can also define toolbars in the actual form in Form Designer as well as a .per file. You can also import a toolbar. So if you've already gone out and created a .4tb XML file with your toolbar specifications, you can actually import that toolbar also at the form level. And again, that's a good way to standardize so that you don't have individual programmers out creating toolbars in forms and perhaps making them all look just a little bit different. Now, this is a good way to standardize. Put all the specifications in a single file, and then everybody imports the toolbar from that file. That way they'll all look the same. And just like we saw a minute ago with top menus, we can also load a toolbar with methods. And there's a class method that we can use to load the toolbar at the interface level so that it's available for all forms. Or we can use the form object method, load toolbar, and just use that toolbar with a specific form. So here's what a toolbar looks like in a .per specification file. I'll try to remember to show you how to define a toolbar or a top menu in Form Designer. It's very simple. I'll try to remember to demo it. Maybe not the whole thing, but get you started. But this is a .per file. It's easier for you to see the definition this way. So here's our toolbar section. And again, we've been doing these in order in the form specification file. So this would go right below the top menu section in that order. See if I can remember off the top of my head. So you've got your schema section. You've got your action defaults section, which if you have action defaults in the form, that would be next. Then you have your top menu section. So if you do use top menus, that would be next. And then now your toolbar section. So it has to be in that order. So here's our items in the toolbar. And again, these are names. This is the important part that provides our binding to the actions in the code. And here we have some text for item close, which remember our action defaults. If we had specified these in our action defaults file, we wouldn't need to do it here as well. So again, another point about standardizing is instead of defining all these text and image and accelerator key attributes at this level, it's really better in most cases to do it in the action defaults so that they're global, right? They're reusable and can be global. Here's the XML file for a toolbar. I won't spend a lot of time on it because very similar to a top menu definition. Well, one thing that is different here, let me point out real quick, is we've got a toolbar item here that's mapped to an on key in the code. It could be, I guess, an action called F5, but that doesn't seem very likely. So this is a toolbar item mapped to an on key. So this is one place where it's use your lowercase f5 to do the binding, and clicking on the toolbar item that the user sees defined as list, right? The text is defined as list. So when the user clicks on the toolbar item labeled list, that's going to have the same effect as if he had used the hotkey, right? The F5 hotkey that's defined here. So that's kind of a nifty thing you can do in the toolbar XML file as well. You can do that in the form, but something you can do with toolbar items, map them to on keys if you like. Here's another one down here, the F1 key. Okay, so we're mapping to an on key in the code. The rest of these are pretty standard. Here's query, add, and again, since these are the names, right, the name attribute is the part that actually will bind these action views to the action in the code. The name is actually going to be handled by the compiler. So if the action, for example, in the code is query with lowercase q, it will still work just fine because the compiler will go ahead and translate all of these names to lowercase before it does the comparison. Right, so these will actually be stored in lowercase. Here's our toolbar attributes. Most of these are similar, so I'll again go fairly quickly. I'll just kind of show you the highlights. Here's the name attribute, of course, which we said is the important one that actually will bind our toolbar items to our actions in the code. So that's our action view binding to the code. Here's something that we might need to talk about. So notice we have this button text hidden attribute. If you want to see the text for toolbars. So if you prefer that the toolbar doesn't have any text underneath the images, which is fairly common, right, not to have a bunch of text under there, you can turn that off. So you can just use this button text hidden that will hide any text that's been defined in the attributes, and that way the user can just see the images, right? So you don't have all that text there. If you prefer to see the text, that's the default, but you can manipulate it dynamically if you like with this button text hidden. Oops, went too fast. There we go. So I think I was a little ahead of myself. Here's the actual attributes for toolbar items. The attributes we were looking at a second ago were for the top level toolbar attributes. Here's the individual toolbar items. So there's the name. Sorry, that's the important part that binds the actual action view that the user sees with the action in the code. So I was a little bit ahead of myself a minute ago. That was the actual attributes for the overall toolbar. These are the attributes for the individual toolbar items here. There's the text that the user sees, comment. You can hide a toolbar item. So a lot of these things very similar to top menu attributes. Even a separator, just like we saw with top menus, there's a hidden attribute for the toolbar separator as well. So here we're loading toolbars. Very similar to loading a top menu, so I'll make it quick. Grab a highlighter. You have an interface method, a class method you can use to load a toolbar so that it's available to all the forms in your application, and you still have the form level. Oops, there we go. The form level method, and of course, since it's an object method, you'll have to get a reference to the specific form, and then you can load the toolbar for that specific form with this method. So this is going to load a toolbar that's been defined in an XML file, right? That .4tb XML file that we talked about a few minutes ago. Now, one thing that's a little different about toolbars than top menus is you can stack toolbars. For example, maybe you load your standard toolbar that all of your forms need to have displayed with the interface method. And then maybe for specific forms, you dynamically load a toolbar with the form method. And then it will actually stack the two toolbars. So the toolbar loaded with the form level is going to be above the toolbar that you load with the interface method, right? So the interface method will be on the bottom, and then if you load a toolbar with the UI.form method, the object method, then it will stack it on top. So stacked toolbars. Okay, so our last menu that we're going to be discussing is start menus. So a start menu is different from the other menus we've been looking at because, of course, the start menu is used to define a tree of commands, but instead of it being related to actions in the code like we're accustomed to, this is just going to be a list of commands that launch other programs, start other programs. So the start menu also cannot be defined at the form level, so you won't see anything in here about defining a start menu in the form specification file. So there's only one start menu for an application, and it's a XML file that gets loaded. So little different behavior, so this part will be a bit different. So program can only have one start menu. They recommend that you create a dedicated BDL program, and I'll show you a very simple one after we finish the presentation, the slide presentation. And that special dedicated BDL program needs to either create or load the start menu. It's much easier to load one that you've already defined than it is to create one from scratch. And then that program needs an interactive instruction in it, like a menu instruction. So there's the basics for start menus. There's different styles for menus, which is what we're looking at here. Here is just the menu style. Grab my highlighter again. So there's the menu style. That's our default style for menus. We have a tree style over here on the right so that the menu is displayed in a tree view. And then down here, kind of in the bottom, is the pop tree style. The pop tree is interesting because it's displayed, you can see, in a pop-up window, but the only thing that opens it is a shortcut, an accelerator key. The default shortcut is Control-Shift-F12, but thankfully you can change that, right? There's a start menu shortcut attribute that we'll see here in a page or two where you can actually change the shortcut to pop up that start menu. Oops, I think I missed one. There we go. So here's the start menu attributes, style attributes. So these are really window style attributes to define how the window will manage start menus. So think of them that way. These are Windows styles. Grab a highlighter here. So this is what we just saw on the previous page. We've got tree, menu, or pop tree. And of course none means that there won't be a start menu displayed. And this is all the different front ends and whether or not they actually support these styles. So here's the start menu size where you can actually specify the size of the start menu if you like. It's got some kind of entertaining values. Tiny, small, medium, huge. Those are all sizes that you can specify for your start menu. Notice that some of the different front ends are very specific that they don't support the start menu size at all. Or for Ajax, it only supports it for tree, which it's really for tree menus anyway, so that's normal. Here's a start menu shortcut. We said you could change for the pop tree, right? That's the method of a start menu that actually gets opened based on a shortcut that the user uses, and that is only supported. The pop tree shortcut is only changeable by the desktop client, the desktop front end. And then you can also specify other accelerators for selected menu items. So you can define two different shortcuts for selected menu items, but only for the desktop client. Here's a start menu in the XML file, what it looks like in the XML files. And these, I don't remember if we've mentioned yet, have a .4sm extension. So you'd create an XML file with a .4sm. You can see that it's an XML file. So here's our start menu and our end down here at the bottom. And we said the big thing that's different here is we don't see a list of actions here, right? If you look in here, there's no names that are associated with actions in the code for start menu commands. Instead, what we see here is this exec equal and then the name of a program that we want to run. So it's different from top menus and toolbars because we're just presenting a list of programs to the user to initiate, to launch. And remember that this is the only way to create a start menu is in an XML file. We can't define start menus in forms because they are by definition at the interface level, not the form level. Here's our start menu attributes. Grab my highlighter. Here's the text we'd see for the title, the start menu title. Text we'd see for the name of a group in the start menu. We can define images if we want to use an icon for a group. Notice we have a disabled attribute for start menus. So remember, hidden is different from disabled. So this is disabled, meaning that it will be grayed out. So it won't be hidden. The user would be able to see it, but it will be disabled so that it cannot be selected. And then we saw the exec equal, and then we'd specify the name of an application that we want to launch when the user selects that specific item. All right, so notice we have that disabled attribute. We can actually configure that or define that at the group level or the individual command level. So a big difference from the other menus we've been looking at. All the other menus have been presenting a list of actions so that we've been defining action views, but here we're actually just defining a list of programs for the user to launch. And here's our method, our interface level method that we'd use to launch our start menu. And of course this is the name of our start menu here, the XML file that ends with a .4sm extension. Notice the path. It's going to look for it in our current directory, kind of our project directory, but it also will use the FGL resource environment variable to scan the list of paths there for that app menu.4sm file. It also will use the db path environment variable as well. So db path is the specific path you can use to set the start menu location, but it will also scan whatever's set for FGL resource path. Okay, multiple document interface, or MDI. Now, with our start menu that we were looking at, the default behavior is those programs, when a user selects one of the commands to launch a program, it's going to be launched into its own separate window. Right? So each program would be independently launched in a separate window. Multiple document interface is just referring to the idea of launching programs from our start menu into an overall parent window instead of each program being displayed in its own separate window. Genero calls it WCI, so you'll see references to WCI if you look at the documentation, Window Container Interface. So that's what Genero calls multiple document interfaces, WCI or Window Container Interface, but it's referring to the same idea of launching programs into a parent container window instead of a separate window. Now you can see from this picture up here that there's a couple of styles. Their default style is for an application to be launched into a separate window that's contained inside the parent container, the parent window. But if you use this particular window style tabbed container and set the value to yes, then it will actually launch the application as a tab inside the parent container, like we see here. So again, that's a style, a window style. Now to use WCI, get the two mixed up, MDI or WCI, you have a little bit of editing to do. You need to, again, create that separate special BDL program to launch the parent container, the parent window. And this is some of the entries we have to put in this program. So we have this UI.interface.setName method that creates a name for the parent container. So this one's the parent container for this example is parent1. And then we have this setName method that specifies what type of container it is. It's a parent container, or what type of window it is. Sorry, I'm getting kind of lost. Container window. I can also specify a couple more special, let's call them attributes of this container window. The text, the title for it, the size for it, if I like, can all be specified. So specifying these methods inside our parent BDL program or our separate BDL program is automatically going to launch this parent window that's going to hold all the child program windows for the programs that the user launches. And then down here at the bottom, notice we've got some logic. If UI.interface.getChildCount is greater than 0, then you must first exit the child programs. So what they're addressing there is the idea that if a user closes the parent container, if he picks a menu option and closes the parent container, if there's any child programs launched, they're also automatically stopped. And of course, you may not want them stopped, and it will create a runtime error. So what they're doing here is making sure that a user doesn't inadvertently close the parent container by picking exit when there are still child applications or child windows associated with that parent container. Otherwise, they'll all shut down and you'll get a runtime error. Now the child programs also have to have some methods added to the program. So we've got this UI.interface.setName that names the child application, or the child container. I keep saying application, but child container. Grab my highlighter. Here our type of container is a child container. Here's the text associated with it. And maybe the most important part is down here at the bottom where the child is specifying the parent container that he wants to attach himself to. Right? So it's the parent1 container that gets defined in that special separate BDL program that launches the parent window, the parent container. So some code that has to be added to implement MDI or WCI, Window Container Interface. Okay, so that's the end of the actual slide part of the presentation. Let's pop back into Studio for a minute or so. We've already been working about an hour and a half, so I don't want to keep you much longer, but let's go ahead and look at some of this in Studio to give you an idea what it looks like. We said that with top menus and toolbars, very similar implementation. So if you know how to implement a top menu or create a top menu or launch a top menu in a form, then you know how to also configure toolbars. So we'll just do a top menu. And if you know how to do it, you should be able to also do toolbars because they're very similar. So let's see, I've got an application. I was afraid we might be running a little low on time, so I've already created a application. Get rid of that real quick. Called Top Menu, just to show you a top menu that I did before class this morning. So it's very simple. It's not very exciting. Let's go ahead and execute it first so we can see what it looks like, and then we'll take a look at it. All right, so here's our top menu. Little pull-down menu at the top. So it only has two groups. We have our options, which doesn't have very many items in it. Got an add, and then I've got a group more with the quit. So just to show you that you could do that. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Here's our .per file. Now we didn't have any action defaults configured here, so we don't have a schema, we're not working with a database. So the very first thing in our form, since we're not using the two higher level sections, is the top menu definition right here at the very top of the form. So here's our top menu. Should have kept that running, but hang on a second, let me kick it off again so you can see it. Oops, I guess I did leave it running. Okay, so there it is. So grab a highlighter. There's options, right? So that's the name of the group, or at least the text associated with the group that the user sees. The name is opt. Then we also have another group. This was more opt, right? More options, mopt for short. And the text that the user sees is more. So there's our two groups we have defined. And then right here we have an add command. So it says these buttons are explicitly defined action views, and that's because we have actually buttons defined in our code for these. But up at the top is our top menu, and we can see, I have to get rid of my highlighter to select anything. There's the add button, right, or the add button that we can select in the top menu. So it's explicitly defined, and anytime you define explicitly, it's either going to be in this top menu structure or my add button that I also have defined as well in the .per file. So notice something that I wanted to show you was that the user can select either one of these add buttons and it will trigger the add action in our code. So I can still use my regular little button that I have defined in my .per file. Right, so it's right here. Notice it triggers the action, and I see triggered action add, which was the only action handling we were doing with that action. And I can still click default. All I've done is add a top menu to my form. And then there's the quit option. So notice I can select quit from here, or I can select quit from somewhere else in the form. So that tells you that there's a big separation between the logic, the actual action handling that gets done in the code, and the action views, or the user interface where the user works with action views. The two are really very separated with BDL. So I can actually define a multitude of action views, and any one of those action views can trigger the action handling in the code, trigger the action in the code. Oh, Lois reminds me I needed to do a demo of Form Designer. Yes, let me show you very quickly here. So let me quit out of this. Thanks for reminding me, Lois. I almost forgot. Okay, here's a good one. So I just have a form here. This is Form Designer. It automatically popped me into when I selected this form. It was created in Form Designer. And all we have here defined in the form is a grid. So what I can do is go to my form structure view, right? I'm going to click and highlight the form. And in my form structure view, here's the form. And I can just right click on it. And there's options here to do all the things we've been talking about. I can add a toolbar, I can add a top menu, I can add action defaults to my form in Form Designer. So this would be your alternative to setting it up in a .per file. So here we'll add a top menu since we've been talking about top menus. Right, so there's my top menu. Notice that something to me that's interesting is unlike a .per file, when you create a top menu in Form Designer, you don't see anything over here in the Designer window. This area over here where I see all my form objects, all I can see is in the Form Structure view. So here in the Form Structure view is where I would create all these special sections, top menus, toolbars, and so on. So there's my top menu, and now I can right-click on my top menu since I've got it created, and here's an option to add my first group. And forgive me, I don't remember the name of the groups, but let's just do one real quick. I'll just make up something. I think it was maybe mopped options. All right, so there's the name of the group. It's really not all that important what the name is because it's not binding a menu option to an action because we're just talking about groups here. So we won't worry about it. Let's go on and create a command. All right, so now we've got a top menu group with a command in it. So this is where our binding will take place at this level. So I'm going to go to Properties. Let me scoot this over so you can see it better. Here's the name, and since we're working with commands, the name is the important part. Excuse me. So I'm going to change the name of this guy to Add. And in the text, of course, is what the user sees, so we'll say Add. Okay, so now we have a top menu command called Add. And it works the same way as setting up these specifications in the .per file. We have an action view now in our top menu called Add. That's the name attribute. And it will automatically be linked to our action Add in our code. Okay. And I can add other groups as well, right? If I want to add another group, because I believe in our example we had 2 groups, I just go back up to the top menu level, right-click, and add another group. Right? So now I have 2 groups. I'm going to go to the Properties and we'll say Options there. Okay. We'll want to change the text. Let me change that real quick as well. That bothers me now. There we go. So I'm going to match it with the text. So that way in the form structure view, it'll be clear what it is. Okay. Was that good, Lois? Is that enough of a demo? The main thing is just making sure that the name attribute matches what you have in the code. You're welcome. And you do the very same thing as well for toolbars, right? It's the very same process to configure a toolbar as well. I'm glad you reminded me. Okay. Let's see, what else? We can load. I have to think for a minute. Let me close this, get the control panel out of my way. We can also load the top menu from an XML file. And since we're low on time, let me just make sure I've got one out here. Here it is. I've got the mytm.4tm, kind of a silly name. Let me close some of these things. No, we don't want to save it. Take a look here. There it is. This is what the XML file looks like for a top menu. So here's our groups we've got defined. Here's our commands. And there's that name attribute that we said is important to bind the names here for our action views to the name of the action in the code. So there's our file. And we can load that instead of defining it in the form, those methods we just looked at to define it in the form, we can load it. So right up here in our application, we can just use that UI interface.method that we talked about. So right here I could say UI.interface. Well, that's what I get for getting in a hurry. Oh, call. No wonder it's upset. Call UI dot. That's better. Have to get the syntax right. Dot. And we want to load a top menu. And then you name the top menu. It's a string. So we have a mytm. Notice you don't have to put the file extension. It'll figure that part out. So from the method name, load top menu, and then just the name without the extension is fine. You can put the extension on if you like, but it's not required. So that's a way to load it at the interface level. So let's see if it works. Kind of did that quickly, so we'll give it a shot. It doesn't like it. Open the file, top menu, .42r. mytm. Let me just take a quick look here. If I can't fix it quickly, we'll go on. It is. Thank you, Scott. All right, let's try it again. That's better. All right, I left it running a minute ago, so it was unhappy because it was already running. So here it is, loaded at the interface level. Okay, so I think we're about out of time, so we'll stop there. I might show you real quickly. I think I have a start menu configured. Let me just see. I was tinkering with start menus right before class, so I think this one's functioning. So here's a start menu. Right, here's our main menu. The whole idea here is just to launch other programs from the start menu. Now, I have not configured the MDI or WCI container so that it gets launched inside of a parent container. So that's why you're seeing the windows independently launched, right? So each program is getting its own independent window. And that's because I haven't gone in and added those methods to implement WCI. So, but that's a simple start menu. I didn't have any subgroups, but I left the start menu syntax out there for groups just so you could see what it looked like if you did have subgroups. But I really just have one top level in my start menu. Very straightforward and simple. So to take a look at it, very small piece of code. So this is that main BDL program that you have to use to create a start menu. So I'm just loading my start menu with this UI.interface load start menu instruction method, It's a class method, naming my start menu, my XML file, and those are just like the other XML files that we've created. You give it a name. You don't have to include the extension in your method. And otherwise, all I have otherwise that's required is some sort of interactive dialogue statement, which we have here with the menu statement. And that's it. If you have any questions about any of the menus we've talked about today or actions that we talked about at the beginning of the session, feel free to send me an email this week if you like. And again, it may take me a day or so to get back with you, but I will get back with you. The session is recorded, so I will put the recording link out there on our training webpage. So if you go out to the 4js.com and go to the training webpage where you registered for the session, this afternoon it will be replaced with a watch recording link. So instead of register now, it will say watch recording. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone attending today. We had a nice group today. The next session will be, of course, in 2 weeks, and the next session is on styles. So if you're interested in styles, make sure you sign up for that session. Thank you very much, and I hope I see you in 2 weeks.